Hey you! Welcome to my channel, A Year and a Day. My name is Jenny and this is my first ever collection video. Now, I have never really felt like doing a collection video myself, but in the past month I enjoyed so many lovely collection videos. And it inspired me to go over my own collection and see what I have, why I have it, what I love about the decks, and maybe even see which decks I would like to let go of in the coming year. Now in this video I hope to share all my tarot decks, and I will share my oracle decks in a next video. And I've tried to categorize the decks a little bit to make it more structured. I have a lot of decks to share here today, so let's just get started. Now let's start with decks that I would classify as classics and clones. And for me, the number one classic is the Rider-Waite-Smith. And this is the Centennial edition. Now, tarot has been around for centuries, and during that time it has known many forms and interpretations. What I like about the Rider-Waite-Smith is that all 78 cards are illustrated. Their stories and meanings are shown through illustrations and not just through pips. I mainly use this deck as a study deck. I got the book The Ultimate Guide to Tarot and basically just went over the whole deck, card by card, studying the images and the symbolism. Tarot is basically a draw it in your own style challenge that has been going on for ages. And I really loved going back to that original source material that so many of modern day tarot decks have been based upon. Now, I actually did a lot of research before getting this deck because I planned on only getting one Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And there are just a lot of different versions out there. But in the end I decided on the Centennial edition because of the color palette. The Centennial edition uses quite toned down colors. And I also love that Pixie's original handwriting and lettering is being used in this version. I also really love the card backs. So yeah, I'm really happy to have this one in my collection as a study deck. And it was the perfect deck to start this collection video with. And that's the Smith-Waite Tarot Deck Centennial Edition. I know I just said that I only planned on getting one Rider-Waite-Smith deck. But when I was visiting Norway last year, I could not resist getting a Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck in Norwegian. Now, I've mentioned here before that this is not my favorite version of this deck. The backs are not really my favorite and the colors are very harsh and bright. It's almost like the contrast of the images has really been cranked up all the way. I don't really like the font that is used. So overall, not my favorite version of the RWS. However, I have very fond memories of getting this deck. We were walking through a rainy city of Bergen when we visited a little witchy shop filled with incense and crystals and tarot decks. And I remember really wanting a deck in Norwegian and the shop owner being really worried that I would not be able to learn tarot with a Norwegian deck. And I gently had to tell her that this would not be my first tarot deck. So even if this is not my favorite version of the RWS, I cannot see myself ever letting this deck go. simply because it reminds me of our wonderful trip to Norway in 2022. And that is the Waite Tarot in Norwegian. Now let's move on to the first deck that I would classify as a clone. And it's the Golden Art Nouveau Tarot, a mass market deck by Lo Scarabeo. For me, a clone is a deck that has its own style, but still follows the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery very, very closely. It uses the same symbolism and really doesn't try to reimagine any of the scenes. And the Golden Art Nouveau Tarot is a lovely example of that. It basically has the same imagery as the Rider-Waite-Smith, but it draws it in its own style. And of course it helps that every card has this gold foiling on it that really makes it shimmer. This deck really makes my inner magpie very, very happy. And it's just a very lovely and fun variation on the Rider-Waite-Smith. In my VR to the Tarot to the Extremes hashtag I did a couple months ago, I actually included this deck as being my daytime tarot deck. Simply because the gold foiling really reminds me of sunlight and it brightens up even the more darker cards. I still really enjoy the art style of this deck, the gold foiling. I really love the backs. So overall, just a very lovely deck to have in my collection, and I am happy to keep it there. And that's the Golden Art Nouveau Tarot. Now let's move on to one of my favorite modern day decks, the Modern Witch Tarot by Lisa Sturl, published by Liminal 11. Now I do not have a lot of decks in my collection depicting modern day life. Somehow that's just not the thing that I'm looking for in tarot. I use tarot as a way to live more mindfully, to reflect, but also to escape reality and to find a deeper connection to Earth. And I have a bit of trouble finding that through decks depicting modern day life. But for some reason the Modern Witch Tarot really brings me a lot of joy. It's very light-hearted and I love the colors that are being used. The warm yellows, the oranges, the mint and the pinks. It just all fits together so wonderfully. And again you see that there is really not much changed in the scenery depicted. It's all very much based on the RWS system, but really transported into modern times. Now I know there are a lot of complaints about the cardstock being used in this deck. The cards are very, very thick and sturdy. So if you're a riffle shuffler, you will probably experience trouble with this deck. But as an overhand shuffler, I don't really mind it. So yeah, it's one of the very few decks depicting modern day life that I have in my collection. But I love it for its light-heartedness and use of color. And that's the Modern Witch Tarot deck. Let's move on to decks in my collection that I would consider inner child decks. Meaning decks that are light-hearted and speak to my inner child, or are just cute AF. Starting with Tarot for All Ages. Now again, it's the illustration style and use of colors that got my attention immediately. The soft yellows, greens, purples, pinks, there's just a certain harmony in the way these colors are combined in this deck. The illustrations could come straight out of a children's book, which I love. And by changing some of the names of the cards, I guess this deck could easily be used by children as well. But when I first got the deck, I made the mistake of thinking that the Tarot for all ages would therefore be a very gentle deck. In times when I needed comfort and a gentle message, I would pick up this deck and would receive very harsh, blunt messages. This deck for me is a real truth teller. It tells it like it is and it does not hold back. I really appreciate the deck for that, but I'm also careful nowadays in bringing this deck out in moments that I feel vulnerable and in search for comfort. Tarot for all ages is a mass market deck that is still widely available for a pretty good price, for example on Amazon. I got my copy for like 13 euros, which is a bargain for a deck like this. And I have always found that you get a lot of value for money with this deck, with its hardcover box, a beautiful little booklet, and of course the cards themselves with their beautiful illustrations and colors. And that is the Tarot for all ages. Let's move on to the Cat Tarot, illustrated by Megan Lynn Cott. This is also a mass market deck that is very easily available. And as a self-proclaimed cat lady, of course I have to have a cat tarot in my collection. But just like the Rider-Waite Smith Tarot, I feel like I only need one cat deck in my collection. And for some reason, this was the version that spoke to me the most. I just absolutely love the sense of humor in this deck. Like the way this very happy dog is the devil. And the cards perfectly depict all the crazy shenanigans a cat can get into every day. I really love the watercolor art style, and for some reason I just haven't found a cat deck out there that depicts the spirit of cats so wonderfully. Now, even if I don't really use this deck a lot in my readings, it is a deck that brings me a lot of joy, and as the only cat tarot in my collection, I am happy to have it. And that is the Cat Tarot. Probably the cutest deck in my collection is the Kawaii Tarot by Mayo. This is another very affordable mass market tarot deck that comes with a hardcover box and little booklet. Now, this is probably the most hysterical tarot deck in my whole collection. As you can see, every single card is jam-packed full of cute little creatures. And I've mentioned here before that this is a very loud tarot deck for me. And what I mean by that is that it's not just visually very busy, but when I go through these cards, it's like I almost can see the movement in all these scenes. It's like I can hear very happy, quick-paced music, and the whole thing just comes to life. Now, this could very easily be nothing more than a cute, gimmicky tarot deck. But what I really love about the Kawaii Tarot is that you could easily use this deck for a proper reading. It follows the RWS meanings and all the reading points are there in the cards. So yeah, just a really fun, light-hearted, cute tarot deck in my collection. And that is the Kawaii Tarot by Lulu Mayo. Another very cute deck in my collection is the Way of the Panda Tarot by Kimberly Tsan, illustrated by Celia Lebel. This is an indie deck and this is actually the mini version of this deck. I was very lucky to pick this one up secondhand for a lovely price, and it's just an absolutely wonderful deck. The production quality and cardstock are amazing. It's this matte, almost rose petally but non-sticky cardstock that I really love. And of course all the pandas are so incredibly cute. The watercolor art style is so lovely and the colors are so happy. But I also like that there is a lot of white space surrounding the illustrations. It kind of calms it down a bit and it makes it great to pair with other decks. And even though it is a cute deck, all emotions are represented here by the pandas. It's not just a gimmicky cute deck, all the reading points are here, even in the harsher, more sad cards. Sometimes I'm tempted to get the bigger version of this deck, but up until now I have decided every time that I really like my little mini version. And my copy actually came with an art print of this extra fairy god panda card, which I really love. So I kind of expect this might be a Kickstarter copy that I got for like 25 euros secondhand, which is really nice. So I'm very happy to have this in my collection. And that is the Way of the Panda Tarot. Let's move on to the next category. And this category has decks that I consider to be kind of my core collection. They are my personal favorites. They are not specifically themed or anything. They are just decks that are very clear readers and that I absolutely love for their illustrations and use of colors. Let's start with the Tarot of Mystical Moments by Catherine Wells Stein. This is a beautiful collage deck, based on the Rider-Waite Smith, but giving its own interpretations. Now, I am usually not a fan of collage style decks. To me, it often feels like a bunch of randomly thrown together images on a card. But for me, the Tarot of Mystical Moments is the exception. There is such intention behind these images, and I really enjoyed going through the guidebook and dissecting every single card, looking for all the meanings and little details. I really appreciate the interpretations of the meanings of the cards and the almost dreamlike, whimsical scenery of the deck. The cards are quite oversized and pretty glossy, and both I love because it makes the imagery that much more visible and vibrant. At the same time, it makes this deck almost impossible for me to shuffle. The combination of large cards and the very slippery cardstock often means that I have a really hard time containing the cards while shuffling. It's really annoying, and that's not really the energy I want to bring into a reading. But even though I would love to have this deck in another cardstock, preferably less slippery, I still really love this deck and consider it one of my favorite decks in my collection. And that's the Tarot of Mystical Moments. Next one is the Cosmic Slumber Tarot by Tilly Walden, published by Liminal 11. Now, as you might have already noticed, I am just a real sucker for pretty illustrations. And for me, the Cosmic Slumber Tarot and a lot of other decks published by Liminal 11 really fit into that category. The Cosmic Slumber Tarot somehow really reminds me of Studio Ghibli. And on top of that, the whole deck is filled with these beautiful, vibrant colors. If I had to assign a certain element to this deck, it would be fire. The landscapes often seem volcanic, and there is a lot of use of warm red tones. At the same time, there are different color palettes being used for each suit, which is something I really love. The Cosmic Slumber is a tarot set in its own universe. It roughly follows the Rider-Waite-Smith, but also does its own thing. Nevertheless, I have had some really profound readings with this deck, and it's pretty safe in my collection. And that is the Cosmic Slumber Tarot. Another Liminal 11 publication is the White Numen Tarot, illustrated by Elba BG. And as soon as I saw some preview images of this, I was absolutely sold. This is actually the limited edition of this deck, which is gold gilded. I don't specifically like the card packs. I think they're a little bit meh. They do not really represent the gorgeous colors of this deck at all. But the illustrations are absolutely beautiful. I love this style. I love the colors that are used. It's very whimsical and sensual. And in a way, I think it's a bit of an underrated deck. I don't really see it around that much. But for me, this really brings together my love for tarot and my love for illustration. You won't really find any niche, esoteric, highly spiritual decks in my collection. I love working with tarot to deal with the human experience, to analyze my own emotions and issues I might have. And having a visual reminder of a certain intention really helps me a lot. Now, not everybody likes this kind of grainy filter they put over the images, but I actually quite like it. It gives a little bit of a certain grittiness to the images. So yeah, not sure what else to say about this lovely deck. For me, it's pure eye candy, but also a usable tarot deck. And that's the White Numen Tarot. Another usable tarot deck that is pure eye candy to me is the Children of Litha Tarot by Alexandria Huntington. I've complained about the cardstock before because it's this really sticky rose petal, but the images are just absolutely stunning. The black backgrounds really make the colors pop, and I love how all the borders are just a little bit different. Every suit is represented by a different group of animals. Swords are represented by birds, wands are represented by animals with paws, so lions and wolves and foxes. The pentacles are represented by hoofed animals, and the cups are represented by creatures that live in the water. Now, the Children of Litha can be quite a bloody deck. There are quite a bit of stabbings going on if you look closely, so it might not be for everyone. But for me, it's one of those decks that I just love flipping through every once in a while. Even when I'm not using the deck, I just really enjoy the artwork and the rose petal finish. Even though it's a bit to shuffle, it gives the deck a lovely, luxurious feel. So yeah, one of my personal favorites, and I hope one day to get my hands on a version with matte cardstock, just because I think I would use the deck quite a bit more if it shuffled a little better. And that's the Children of Litha Tarot. On to the Divine Feminine Tarot by Kokorina. If I would be into tarot just for the tarot, one deck would probably be enough. But tarot combines so many things I love. It's the illustrations, the colors, the playing with emotions, and beautiful product design. And Kokorina is a perfect example when it comes down to beautiful product design. Receiving this deck was a true gift. The packaging was absolutely beautiful, and the deck itself is pure eye candy as well. The illustrations are lovely, and even though the deck is quite muted in the use of colors, there's quite a bit of gold foiling throughout the deck to really bring these images to life. In the VR I did to the hashtag Tarot to the Extreme a few months ago, this was my nighttime tarot deck. And I think it's pretty obvious why. These beings are not even on Earth anymore. And I'm looking forward to a Kickstarter I recently backed by Kokorina called the Soul Tarot, which will focus on the sun. And I expect that one to be a lovely addition to my collection, next to this one, my nighttime deck. And that's the Divine Feminine Tarot. The Zodiac Tarot, illustrated by Ana Chavez and published by US Games, is a deck that I only got a few weeks ago. I gifted myself this deck right after Christmas and etched the cards in black. Now, the Zodiac Tarot is closely following the RWS system and is therefore a pretty clear reader. On top of that, the guidebook focuses on the zodiac signs, and to be completely honest, I have zero knowledge about that. I had kind of expected this deck to be a good learning experience when it came to the zodiac signs, but up until now the guidebook is not super informative. But to be honest, I wasn't really in it for the zodiac signs. I really wanted this deck because I absolutely love the illustrations. And I've mentioned it before and I'm going to mention it again. It's the whole combination of the illustration style and the use of colors that really catches my eye. And in this case we have the black backgrounds with those beautiful vibrant colors that are being used in the illustrations. And again, I like to use tarot as visual reminders for my own intentions, and therefore I also love displaying my tarot cards. So having a beautiful tarot deck where you really are drawn to the illustrations is just a really lovely bonus. The cardstock is not my favorite. It's kind of glossy and it shows a lot of fingerprints. But because I love the illustration so much, it is something that is easy to overlook. And I'm very happy to have this beautiful, easy to read deck in my collection. And if you like this deck as well, it's mass market, affordable and easily available. And that's the Zodiac Tarot. Next up is another indie deck, the Iona Tarot. And this is a deck that I bought about 5 minutes after seeing it for the first time. It's funny, I can have decks on my wish list for years and not get them. And then there are decks that I spot somewhere and immediately buy. And for this one the reason is that I recognized it to be a deck that was very unique in my collection. You don't see this pencil drawing style very often in tarot decks. And I also love that all the scenes are pretty zoomed in. They're almost like portraits rather than full-on scenes. And I found the color palette and the zoomed in portrait-like images to be a lot of fun to pair with other decks. So even if this was a complete impulse buy, I am still pretty happy to have it in my collection. And that is the Iona Tarot. A deck that became an immediate favorite was the Self-Love Tarot by Hannah Tricoire. I actually got this indie deck as part of a Kickstarter campaign by the creator for a yoga cards deck. And for an amazing price you could also receive the Self-Love Tarot. So I got both because I had been really interested in this beautifully colorful tarot deck, and I have been loving it ever since. I absolutely love the use of colors in this deck. The combination of warm and cool tones are just so very well done. There is a certain balance and harmony within this deck. All the figures are perfect in all their imperfections. They are a little bit wobbly, a little bit hairy, but the whole point of this deck is self-love and self-acceptance. Also, my secret code name for this deck is the VJJ deck, because there are just VJJs all over the place. Overall, it's just a very feminine, warm, loving deck that feels a bit like a big hug, with lots of positive, loving messages in the guidebook. And that's the Self-Love Tarot. And those were the decks I kind of consider to be my core collection. They do not have a specific theme, but I just really love them for their illustration style and the lovely use of colors. They always bring me clear messages and they are definitely some of my personal favorites. Next category are Druid and Pagan decks that I use to connect closely to nature and earth. Starting with the DruidCraft Tarot by Philip and Stephanie Carr-Gom, illustrated by Will Worthington. This deck originally comes with quite big borders, making the cards pretty large, but I trimmed my copy down to the artwork and etched the deck in yellow. First things first, I absolutely hate the cardstock of my copy of the DruidCraft. It's this really glossy cardstock that shows fingerprints, and I just am not a fan at all. But that being said, the DruidCraft Tarot is one of my favorite decks in my collection, and it's very close to my heart. It follows the Rider-Waite-Smith system pretty closely, so it's a very easy read. At the same time, it transports us back to the time of the Druids. The deck shows a way of life back when humanity still had a very close relationship to nature. The deck is filled with symbols, plants, and mythical creatures relating to that time. And the guidebook is an absolutely wonderful source of knowledge. For me, the DruidCraft is this perfect balance between a deck that is very easily readable without a guidebook, because the scenes depict the RWS meanings perfectly, but at the same time, when you do want to refer to the guidebook, a whole world of knowledge is added. So there are multiple layers within this deck, and the longer you work with it, the deeper your relationship with the deck and its meanings will get. And that's something that I really love about this deck. So even though the cardstock is really not my favorite, and trimming this deck was a real pain in the ass and it's super wonky, this is definitely one of my favorite decks from my collection. Now, the DruidCraft is a mass market deck and it's widely available. I even heard that it is available in matte cardstock, although I always get confused about which version I need to buy. So I just keep on enjoying my wonky glossy version of this deck. And that is the wonderful DruidCraft Tarot. Another one of my personal favorites is the Wildwood Tarot by Mark Ryan and John Matthews, also illustrated by Will Worthington. I actually have 2 copies of this deck, and the version that I keep in this beautiful wrap I found on Etsy is the version that I usually read with. I trimmed off the borders on 3 sides, but left the titles and keywords, and I etched it in yellow. Now, this is actually one of the very few decks in my collection that I have an extra copy of, because it was one of the first decks that I was trimming and I was a bit nervous, so I felt like I needed a backup copy. But surprise, the backup copy I got turned out to have a completely different cardstock than the original one. As you can see, my backup copy has a cardstock very similar to the DruidCraft one. It's pretty glossy and you can see all the fingerprints. But I had already started trimming my matte version of the deck, so here it is. I have 2 versions of the Wildwood. Now, I will start my year in the Wildwood in February, which is basically a guided deep dive into this tarot deck. And I am now very happy to have 2 copies of this deck, because I am planning on using my backup copy for that guided deep dive, while still having the other matte copy available for readings. Now, where the DruidCraft, also illustrated by Will Worthington, closely follows the RWS, the Wildwood Tarot does its own thing. I still heavily rely on the guidebook when reading with the Wildwood Tarot, but still this is a deck that really speaks to my heart. The theme of this deck is humanity's relationship with nature. The guidebook speaks a lot about the influence we as humans have on our planet. I am usually a very live and let live person, but I do find myself having a pretty strong opinion about what we are doing as humanity to our planet. And being able to relate that to a tarot deck and to the whole vision of this deck is something that is really comforting and confronting. I've mentioned here before that the Wildwood Tarot is not a tarot deck I use for just any daily reading. I've had some really profound readings with this deck, and it has made me decide to only use this deck for the bigger questions in life. That being said, I really look forward to my year in the Wildwood, to really do a deep dive into the imagery and symbolism and stories within this deck. And that is the Wildwood Tarot. Now let's move on to the next category. These are all my decks that have specific themes. And let's start with this fun little Kickstarter called the Arcana Saurus by Artis Magicae. Now, I'm usually not into major only decks, but for this one, of course, I could not resist the theme, which is dinosaurs. Now, the font that is being used gives this whole thing a little bit of a Jurassic Park / Flintstones vibe to me. But as someone who was a huge dinosaur lover as a child, this one really spoke to me. But this one has remained a very gimmicky deck in my collection. I have never used it for a reading and don't really expect to. Also, I found this little mistake in the deck that bugs me a little, where it's pretty clear that the numbers and titles for the High Priestess and the High Priest have been switched. I have no idea if the decks that you can get through their Etsy shop at the moment still have this mistake. Hopefully someone noticed and they fixed it. But like I said, this deck is pretty much a gimmicky deck in my collection that I got for sentimental reasons. But even though it is such a fun little deck, I think it has served its purpose in my collection and I am ready to let it go in 2023. So this is one of the decks that I will be rehoming this year. And that's the Arcana Saurus Majors Only deck. Next up is the Tarot of the Dream Enchantress, illustrated by Marco Nizzoli and published by Lo Scarabeo. This is a mass market deck that is still available, although I think the edition you can get nowadays is the borderless edition, which has slightly different backings. I decided to trim my version to make the artwork stand out a little bit better. Tarot of the Dream Enchantress is a deck filled with fantastical beings, but for me it has really strong fae energy. I love the watercolor art style and the whole realm filled with fantastical beings. Also, this death card just creeps the hell out of me. I love it. And don't even get me started on this one. Now, I don't have a lot of decks in my collection that give me these strong Fae vibes, but the Tarot of the Dream Enchantress does, which is why I love keeping it in my collection, even if I don't read with it a ton. And that's the Tarot of the Dream Enchantress. The Undersea Tarot is an out-of-print deck, illustrated by Jesiel Sanchez Martinez and published by US Games. This was kind of an impulse buy last year, because when I saw this deck online, the artwork instantly reminded me of comic books. And after doing some research, I found out that the creators are indeed comic book illustrators. Now, you can find this deck online for out-of-print prices, but I managed to get my copy for under 20 euros on Amazon. And I'm glad I didn't pay a huge price for this deck. Even though I love the comic book vibes, the illustrations do feel a little bit outdated and flat somehow. The original deck also came with these huge blue borders that I really didn't like, so in the end I just decided to trim them off. And it makes the artwork stand out so much better. This is a lovely themed tarot deck filled with undersea creatures and mermaids. And even though I haven't read with this deck yet, and it's still a bit of a gimmicky deck in my collection, I do really love having it around. And that's the Undersea Tarot. Let's stay with the ocean for a moment and check out the Tempest Tarot by Tarot by Macy. Another ocean themed deck, but a completely different vibe. This deck had some real calming vibes with lots of white space, toned down colors, a limited palette and clean line work. The artwork reminds me a little of the original Rider-Waite Smith, even including the artist autograph on every card. Now, I am much more of the forest than I am of the sea. But still, it is lovely to have certain decks in my collection that have these specific themes. And between the Undersea Tarot and the Tempest Tarot, I have plenty of ocean themed decks in my collection for the moment. And that is the Tempest Tarot. Let's move on to fairy tales with the Tarot of the Divine, illustrated by Yoshi Yoshitani. This deck is based on fairy tales from around the world. And I actually also got the Beneath the Moon book, written by Yoshi Yoshitani, describing the stories that these cards are based on. And I was planning to do a deep dive into this deck before reading with it, making my way through the stories in the Beneath the Moon book. But for some reason I got distracted and gave up halfway. And it has kind of prevented me from picking up this deck and reading with it. The images are so beautiful and colorful, and I love the theme of this deck. But for some reason I have not connected to it yet. So I will have to think this year how to get acquainted with these cards and how to bond with this deck. And if not, if I treasure it enough to keep it in my collection. And that's the Tarot of the Divine. Next up is the Monsoon Tarot by Senja, a Kickstarter I recently backed. The Monsoon Tarot is a tarot filled with dreamscapes. The whole art style and vibe reminded me of Studio Ghibli, which is exactly why I decided to back this one. Now, their delivery was super quick. Within a few months, this deck arrived at my home. It is relatively new in my collection and I have not worked with it yet. And to be honest, I am not quite sure yet what to think of this deck. I feel like there is so much to unpack in every single card. And I would have loved to have an extensive guidebook to maybe fall back on a little. Unfortunately, the guidebook is really minimal, only providing a couple of basic keywords. On the other hand, that gives you room to completely freely interpret the meanings. And the more I look at this deck, the more layers I discover. So I will definitely be giving this one a chance. And that's the Monsoon Tarot. Next up is the Sleepwalker Tarot, also by Senja, who also created the Monsoon Tarot. The colors are so vibrant and I absolutely love the combination of the green backs and yellow edges. The gimmick of this deck is that every character is asleep, or at least has their eyes closed. But that's really not the reason why I backed this one on Kickstarter. The illustration style and vibrant, beautiful colors immediately got my attention. For some reason, this deck has a bit of a Disney vibe, filled with princes and princesses and castles. Although there is the occasional cut off hand, I'm not really sure why it had to be that graphic. It really does not match the vibe of the deck at all. Also, there was this extra card called Sober that didn't really make sense to me, so I left it out of the deck for now. Either way, I feel like this is the most Disney deck I have in my collection, and I appreciate the deck for that. I've only had this one in my collection for a short while, so I will gladly give it a chance. And that is the Sleepwalker Tarot. Last one in the themed decks category is the Runic Tarot Kit by Jack Sephiroth, published by Los Scarabeo. This is a mass market deck that combines a few things I like: runes, Vikings, and Norse mythology. Now, I am usually very careful when it comes to criticizing the artwork of a deck. It's all a matter of taste, and what doesn't work for me will work for another. I also know how many hours of hard work goes into creating a deck like this. So please know that it is my absolute personal opinion when I say that this deck is corny as fuck. And honestly, I don't really know why I got it in the first place. The whole deck has this like photoshopped 90s fantasy vibe to it. And it's so far from the aesthetic I usually go for. I guess in the end I couldn't resist the combination of runes, Norse mythology and Vikings. Because I don't really know of a deck that combines all of those things. So the whole concept really speaks to me, and I think it's really, really cool. Now, I've done readings with it and it reads lovely. I like the guidebook and all the information that comes with it. But I can't get over the artwork. It's just not my thing, and it really stops me from using this deck. But I guess it proves how important my link to the artwork is for me when it comes down to working with tarot. So even though I would love to keep it just because I don't have a good alternative for this deck, I think I will be letting this one go in 2023. And that's the Runic Tarot Kit. Next category are the dark and spooky decks. Starting with the Nightmare Before Christmas Tarot, illustrated by Abigail Larson and published by Insight Editions. Insight Editions is a publisher that has been spitting out pop culture decks left, right and center. They have bought the rights to quite a bit of TV shows and movies, but the decks themselves have been kind of lacking quality. The pips are often pretty lazy, and it's often very clear that the decks have been produced under a lot of time pressure. And they have been getting quite a bit of slack from that from the tarot community, because it kind of feels like a money grab. But for me, the Nightmare Before Christmas Tarot is the exception. I absolutely love the illustrations by Abigail Larson. I think her whole style and vibe fits Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas perfectly. But I also just in general really enjoy her art style. And this is my number one go-to deck in the festive season. For me, it's a very clear reader with a lovely guidebook that always brings me such clear messages. So I've really made a connection with this deck, and I cannot see myself going through a festive season without it. And that's the Nightmare Before Christmas Tarot. I actually forgot that I do have another tarot by Insight Editions, and it's the Tarot del Toro, based on the works of director Guillermo del Toro. This deck actually has illustrations based on wood carvings by Tomás Hio. Now, I will be honest, I have never read with this deck. And I'm also not sure if I would have picked it out for myself. It is very pippish, and I usually do not feel called to work with pip decks. However, this was a gift from my husband, who is a huge Del Toro fan. And for that reason, I absolutely love having this deck in my collection. And I would never even consider rehoming this one. And that's the Tarot del Toro. On to the Darkwood Tarot, illustrated by Abigail Larson, who also did the Nightmare Before Christmas Tarot. This is a mass market deck published by Llewellyn. And I have to admit, I was a bit underwhelmed when I first got my hands on this tarot. The cardstock is absolutely not my favorite. It feels very flimsy, and there are two cards that kind of stand out and have a little bow in it. So I always know where to find the King of Pentacles and the Fool. Also, I would have loved for these cards to be bigger, but only because I love the artwork so much. And I think with bigger cards, the artwork would stand out so much better. The deck comes with a big guidebook, which actually tells a story set in the Darkwood. But even though I love that concept, I haven't read the entire guidebook yet. And I would love to say that one day I will do a deep dive and read this guidebook cover to cover. But to be honest, I don't know if I will ever get around to it. Especially considering I have so many intentions when it comes to deep dives. But in this case, it will not be a reason for me to rehome this deck. I simply enjoy the artwork too much, so I will happily keep this one in my collection. And that's the Darkwood Tarot. Next up is the Haworth Tarot, a dark, freaky tarot based on a podcast I've never heard. But something in this artwork really drew me in. I love the combination of really dark, creepy images and pastel colors. There's a fun contrast in that I really found interesting. Now, I know by now that dark decks aren't really for me. I'm just not drawn to them enough to do actual readings with. And there are decks in my collection that will be leaving for that reason. But the Haworth will stay for now. I just really enjoy the artwork and the colors and the contrast between those. And for now I just can't bring myself to rehome this one. It's just a really unique deck in my collection and I like having it around. And that's the Haworth Tarot. A gory deck that will be leaving my collection is Le Tarot de Marseille par Polka. I got this deck second hand and as you can see the box is completely messed up. But the cards are as good as new. Now this is a very bloody, gory deck. But I really love the way these characters are drawn. So I decided to get it second hand for a small price. But in the end there's just too much working against this deck for me. There's the gore and blood that really doesn't invite me or pull me in. And of course it's a Tarot de Marseille, so it's a pip deck. And like I've said before, pip decks are just not really my thing. For a large part I'm in it for the illustrations, for the stories, for telling stories with illustrations. And pips just don't really do it for me. So the pips combined with the gory mess makes me never want to read with this deck. So I might as well rehome this one. And that's Le Tarot de Marseille par Polka. Next up is a pretty awesome Kickstarter I backed a few years ago. The Cthulhu Dark Arts Tarot. Now as you can see the box is huge and this Kickstarter came with a lot of goodies. The deck itself is huge as well. It's way bigger than standard tarot size. Now the illustrations of this deck are absolutely beautiful. They are inspired by H.P. Lovecraft and they're filled with demons, monsters and other horror stuff. But they are so incredibly detailed. It's insane. So it's a good thing this deck is so huge because it really gives you a chance to admire the artwork in full. That being said, this is another pip deck. So even if I was able to shuffle these huge cards and look past the blood and gore and demons, this deck is very pippish. So I've never done a reading with this deck before. And I guess the only reason I still have it is because the deck comes with a few lovely goodies. There were some pins in this Kickstarter, but also some amazingly beautiful prints of the cards. And I had it in my mind that I would one day frame these prints, but I still haven't done so. And I guess what I am trying to do with my collection is to have all the decks I own in either one of two categories. Either they are decks I use, or they are decks that I treasure. And when I say treasure, what I mean is I want to become Gollum. I want to hold my precious and admire my precious and just be in awe of a deck and its quality or the illustrations. And if I do not have that feeling with a deck and I do not use it, then maybe it's time to let it go. And that's kind of the case with this tarot as well. Even though I think the prints are amazing, the illustrations are absolutely beautiful, I have never read with this deck and I have no intention to do so. Also, I don't really go through the deck that often and I've kind of forgotten about the prints until I was doing this video. So for me that's a very good indication that it's time for me to let go of this deck. And that's the Cthulhu Dark Arts Tarot. And those were my dark and spooky decks. Now, even though we are nearing the end of my collection, we still have a few decks to go. So let's continue with some vintage decks. Starting with the Aquarian Tarot. I got this one pretty early on in my tarot journey. Because I was studying the RWS and was interested in the classics. And the Aquarian Tarot is definitely a classic. The Aquarian Tarot was published in 1970 by US Games and it's still widely available. But I really wanted a copy with these beautiful blue borderless backs. So I ignored the mass market versions that are out there and I started looking for one secondhand. And I believe this copy is from somewhere in the 80s or 90s. This is Art Nouveau meets the 70s. And I love going through this deck, admiring the artwork and the beautiful colors. Do I ever feel called to use this deck in a reading? No, not really. There's something about the faces that throws me off a bit. But maybe I should give it a chance someday and try it in a reading. But for now I'm also just perfectly fine with just keeping it in my collection to admire every once in a while. The Aquarian Tarot is a pretty big part of tarot history, and for that reason alone I like having it in my collection. So that's my vintage copy of the Aquarian Tarot. Next up is a fun one. This is an out-of-print deck called Tarot of the Animal Lords, published by Los Scarabeo. This is a deck filled with anthropomorphic animals, or creatures that are part human, part animal. Now I know the Tarot of Curious Creatures is really popular at the moment, but for me this is the OG version of that. I got this deck because I was really hesitating in getting the Fantastic Menagerie Tarot by Baba Studios. So instead of getting that one, I got this one. But then I ended up getting the Fantastic Menagerie anyways. But I really like this deck. I like the soft colors and the art style. I also love that it kind of looks like someone in the 70s took acid and then drew this deck. It's just a little bit out there and a little bit crazy. But for some reason it really works. Now, funny thing about this deck is that you can find it online for out of print prices when you search for the deck under the title Tarot of the Animal Lords. But I found a loophole. The Dutch version of this deck is called Tarot van het Dierenrijk. It's exactly the same deck as Tarot of the Animal Lords, but the packaging is different. It comes in this rather large box with a Dutch guidebook. I wasn't expecting anything from this, but the book was actually pretty good. So I got my copy for like 15 euros or something. And if you are interested in this deck, I highly recommend searching for the Dutch version, because they still come up every now and then, and you won't pay ridiculously high out-of-print prices. I never really see this deck around, which I think it's a real shame, but I'm very happy to have it in my collection. And that's Tarot of the Animal Lords, or Tarot van het Dierenrijk. Next up are all my editions of the Arcus Arcanum Tarot. This is a vintage out-of-print tarot deck, first published in 1986 and illustrated by Hans-Rudi Wescher, a comic book illustrator. Now, I had been looking for this deck online when I came across this Major Arcana edition on a second-hand website, and it turned out the seller was living only a few minutes away. This little deck was the first edition of the Arcus Arcanum, and it was published 1 year before the publication of the full tarot. This copy had belonged to the seller's father, who had recently passed away. She was selling it for a very reasonable price, and I was happy to pick it up. This is a very nostalgic deck for me. The artwork greatly reminds me of comic books I read as a child in the 80s. And I don't really think there are tarot decks out there that really compare to this one. But I still wanted to get my hands on a full copy of the Arcus Arcanum. So I was very happy when my lovely husband gifted a copy to me for my birthday last year. This is an English version of the deck, and the cards really are in mint condition. It made me a little bit hesitant to actually use this deck. I treasure it so much, and I was really worried something would happen with my copy. So when I found out that this tarot was actually used in a tarot kit called Berufung und Beruf, which was basically a reprint of this deck, I tried to find a copy for a reasonable price, and I was lucky to get my hands on one. This is the version of the deck that came with the Berufung und Beruf tarot kit. This is a German version, and the guidebook that came with it was also in German. It had very little to do with the Arcus Arcanum itself, but I didn't read very good reviews about this one, so I haven't really made an effort to translate this one. But I was very happy to have a copy that I could be a little less precious with. So I decided to trim this copy to make the artwork really stand out. And I have zero regrets about it. This is the deck that I actually do my readings with when I work with this deck, and I love it. It's very unique, it speaks to my inner child, and I absolutely love the illustrations. So a very nostalgic deck of which I have 3 versions, and that's the Arcus Arcanum Tarot. Next up are the Can't Read With Them But Love Them Anyways decks. Starting with the Iona Tarot 5th edition. which I am keeping in this green pouch because I'm sure I will otherwise ruin the tuck box. The creator of this deck has released several editions of this tarot deck, and all the editions differ in the use of colors or shape and size. But I really like this 5th edition, which had a botanical theme and inspiration, using a lot of greens and yellows, which I absolutely loved. But my main issue with this deck is the language. This deck is in Galician, which is spoken in the northwestern parts of Spain. But even though I created cheat sheets and tried to learn the names of the suits and majors, the language barrier is just too much hassle for me. I am not an intuitive reader. I like to read the cards based on their meanings, whether that be RWS or something else that the creator provides. And not being able to read the keywords is just too frustrating for me. The additional step of having to translate is just too much hassle and takes me out of the flow of a reading. That being said, I love keeping this deck in my collection. It's a lovely cardstock, a lovely size, and I absolutely love the illustrations. So definitely a deck I treasure and love to keep around. And hopefully one day I will find a way to read with this deck as well. And that's the Iona Tarot 5th edition. Another tarot deck I truly love but cannot seem to work with is the Litha Tarot by Marion Constantine. She is the creator of the amazing Reclaim Oracle. And when I saw that she was launching a Kickstarter for a tarot deck, I didn't even think twice to back it. I really love the cardstock of this deck. It's this matte, super smooth cardstock that seems a bit similar to the way of the Panda Tarot. So just flipping through this deck is a lovely experience. And on top of that, all the beautiful colors and illustrations really make this deck one to treasure. That being said, I cannot read with this deck. I, for some reason, have so much trouble identifying the cards I am looking at. It makes me feel really stupid, like I am missing something. But in most of the cards there is so much going on, it's just not immediately clear to me if I'm looking at a court card or a minor. And again, that really takes me out of the flow of a reading. I guess I'm looking for that perfect balance in a tarot deck. It doesn't have to be a complete copy or clone of the RWS. But if it's too vague and it doesn't speak to me at all, I'm kind of lost in my reading. And I'm not feeling any joy in reading with a deck. So unfortunately, I have not been able to read with the Litha Tarot yet. But like I said, I love the creator, I love the artwork, and I love the overall quality of this deck so much that I will happily keep it in my collection. And hopefully one day I will find a way to read with this after doing a deep dive, or maybe just later on in my tarot journey. And that's the Litha Tarot. I can't believe it, but we have arrived at the last category of my collection video. And these are my classical art decks. Starting with the fantastic Menagerie Tarot by Baba Studio. And I will be honest, this was a complete FOMO purchase. Everybody is always praising Baba Studio for their amazing quality and artwork, and I really felt I was missing out. First, I decided to get the Tarot of the Animal Lords instead, but I ended up getting the Fantastic Menagerie anyways. The Baba Studio decks are pricey. This is probably one of the most expensive decks in my collection. And it's quite a shame because I have not bonded with this deck whatsoever. It feels a bit cold to me. There's a distance there. Maybe it's because it's such an expensive deck that I didn't really feel free to work with it. It felt more like a museum piece in my collection. So even though it's a beautiful quality deck with lovely artwork, I do not see myself working with this deck at all. And I also don't treasure it enough to keep around. So I decided last year that I will be rehoming this deck, and I expect that to happen somewhere in 2023. And that's the Fantastic Menagerie Tarot. And you would think that I would have learned my lesson after the Fantastic Menagerie, but no. I decided to get the Victorian Romantic Tarot by Baba Studio as well. This latest edition came in this beautiful wooden box that isn't really practical, but it's pretty. And again, the quality of this deck is amazing. The cardstock is absolutely lovely and the images are so bright and colorful. The big guidebook that you can order separately is really interesting and insightful. But again, I feel very distant from this deck. The images are very clear and crisp, and they're beautiful, but somehow I just do not connect to them at all. The truth is, I have other decks using this art style that I feel more connected to, that bring me a certain warmth. And I always end up picking other decks over the Victorian Romantic Tarot. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is one leaving my collection in 2023. And that's the Victorian Romantic Tarot. Next up is the Terra Volatile Tarot, of which I have 2 editions. Let's start with my wonky edition. This one has linen cardstock, and there were some issues with the printing and overall quality of the deck. So the creators kindly offered to replace this wonky edition. The Terra Volatile is a beautiful tarot deck, filled with symbolism, mythology and the occult. It actually has a whole extra suit that relates to alchemy, and lots of alternative cards to choose from. Now, because there are so much layers to this deck, I would have loved to have a physical guidebook. Unfortunately for me, the guidebook is only available online, and it's really good. But somehow that extra step of having to go online to read a guidebook is just too much for me. It takes me out of the flow of a reading, and I just really don't like that. The replacement edition of this wonky version was a beautiful collector's edition in a hardcover box with heavy cardstock. But I really do not need 2 copies of this deck. And because the heavier edition is a bit hard to shuffle, I will be rehoming this version in 2023. I will keep my wonky edition because I love the artwork, and hopefully one day I will either be able to buy the physical guidebook or find the energy and time to print it out myself. And that's the Terra Volatile Tarot. Next is the Revival Art Tarot by Tarocco Studio. and this is the deck that I usually pick over the Victorian Romantic Tarot. There is a certain warmth to this deck that I really miss in the Victorian Romantic. Maybe because it's borderless and there's less white space. I don't know. All I know is that I really love the soft tones of this deck, and the beautiful artwork stands out so lovely. I like the borders and the titles. I just think it's a really, really lovely deck. The only side note I would make is that the little guidebook does not reference the original paintings that were used, which I think is a real shame. And of course you can figure it out yourself, but if you are using existing artwork, at least have the courtesy to mention the work that you are using. But despite that, I really, really love this deck, and it will stay in my collection. And that's the Revival Art Tarot. Last but certainly not least is the Majestic Earth Tarot by J.D. Hildegard Hinkle. I am so very happy that I got my hands on this out of print deck, because it's absolutely gorgeous. The cards have this matte cardstock that makes a little bit of a whooshing sound when you go through them. The backs of the cards are gorgeous, and the cards themselves are filled with the most beautiful landscapes. The cards have both titles and keywords, and the little borders at the bottom are color coordinated to the suits and majors. I just really love the whole vibe of this deck, and I love pulling it out for a reading. I also love pairing this deck with other decks for my collection. I love using the landscapes as a sort of focus point in a reading. It's a bit like pathworking. You're really setting the scene with a deck like this. And that's a lovely concept to play with in a reading. So this is a deck in my collection I truly treasure. And it's lovely to be able to conclude my tarot collection video with. And it's the Majestic Earth Tarot. And that's it. That was my tarot collection at the start of 2023. I hope you enjoyed seeing all the decks in my collection, just as much as I loved showing them. Working with tarot has brought me so much joy and healing and comfort. And all the decks I use for that have a very special place in my heart. I hope I was able to put into words why I liked all these different decks. And even the decks I will be rehoming, I appreciate for one reason or another. So, if you've made it through the entire video, thank you so much for watching and for liking, subscribing and commenting on my videos. I hope to share my Oracle collection as soon as possible. But for now, I wish you all a lovely rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!